Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we are joined by Sean Bell, retired Air Vice-Marshal and military analyst, and also the host of the Red Matrix podcast. Sean, thank you very much for joining us again.
Louis, it's always a pleasure.
It's great to have you back. Well, Vladimir Putin, speaking at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit today, has said he believes that the Alaska summit with Trump opened the way to peace in Ukraine. How do you judge where we are in this war, Sean? And is peace any closer than it was a few months ago?
Yeah, there's a lot in that question, isn't there? Can we unpick that a little bit? One of which is that let's start with the Alaska summit. I think there was an air of expectation around that summit that we were somehow following, 3.5 years of war, that we were getting near the beginning of the end, and that somehow this was, President Trump's moment to draw this horrible war to a close. And we saw some pretty difficult images during that summit. Trump clapping Putin as he approached the dais, warmly welcoming the Russian leader, who bluntly is responsible for this war. But you just sense that there would be compromise required, and maybe this was the way of doing it. You look back on that period now, and what has happened since? Absolutely nothing. Putin has continued his attacks. They've had the second largest series of strikes on Kyiv since the start of the war. Russia maintaining momentum on the front line. So nothing's happened there. The next thing that I think, going on to the Shanghai conference, I think what's been fascinating is the West has sort of graduated away from providing some military aid to Ukraine, but to writing stiff letters, to summoning ambassadors, and frankly, I can just imagine Putin chuckling away. The one thing we have done is really slowly is to gradually ramp up sanctions and the like. And I think what President Putin has very, very effectively done, following the sort of annexation of Crimea, he's learned how to bypass these sanctions. And rather than the world isolating Russia, making it feel the pariah, putting it out in the cold, actually what Putin has done is simply generate his own little fiefdom. He's got his own community, and the Shanghai conference is just one example of it. That America, if you want to have a part of the world that you dominate, well, we're going to have a part of the world that doesn't think the way that you think. And it's the warm embraces of Xi Jinping from China, but also some of those North Korean leaders, the Iranian leadership, and the like. And even now we've got India that's siding that way because of sanctions. It's feeling the heat. It's buying a lot more oil from Russia than the West would like. And I just think there's a whole sense here that this is all part of an elaborate plan from President Putin to survive sanctions and indeed generate an alter ego to the West. And I think we're seeing that alive and well. So I know that's a long answer, but bringing it back full circle, does it mean we're any close to the end of the war? No, it doesn't.
Well, yeah, and also I mentioned there the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. How worried should we be about what we see coming out of that conference this morning for us? India seemingly moving a lot closer to China and Russia obviously just doubling down on their ties with China.
One of the challenges, I think, is that we can think that other nations should be more philanthropic or should think the way that we think. But you can't put a McDonald's on every street corner and give women the vote and suddenly declare democracy is rife. Unfortunately, that's not the way it works. And sanctions is a very crude tool because in effect it's punishing people for not thinking and doing the way you're doing. India is a very vibrant economy, but every world country will only ever operate in its own self-interest. And therefore, that's what America's doing now very, very pointedly and actually setting the tone for the rest of the world. India has got a massive population, it's got its own challenges. It, therefore, is trying to capitalize on the situation they finds itself at the moment where the West isn't buying Russian oil, Russia is struggling to sell it, therefore it is having to sell it at a discount. So lots of countries like India going, great, we can buy cheaper oil. The fact that the West may not like that is irrelevant. India is operating off its own national interest. And either you sanction the hell out of India so that it's no longer in its national interest. The problem with that is you are bullying India. You are bullying it into doing what you want. No nation responds well to that, and therefore, at the moment, Modi and all of the leaders are turning around and going, "Okay, we have now a common view of the world." It doesn't mean we are bedfellows. It just means that economically, we see a way of navigating our way through this. India doesn't isn't critical of Russia. It may not agree with what Russia's doing, but it's not directly affected by it, and therefore is capitalizing by getting cheaper oil, which means that it can achieve more of its strategic objectives more cost effectively. So I think this is inevitable. The worry is that history books may well be written about this chapter that say if we now have this sort of axis of evil, some of the commentators have called it, if that gets generated and starts to gain momentum, have we actually been responsible for generating that through our actions? And I do think that's one of the things that, because we've been so slow, everybody has their own views. It's been incredibly slow to actually, 3.5 years, we're still talking about sanctions that quite bluntly should have been in place hard ages ago. If we'd not messed around with these sanctions and actually forced Russia's hand, 6 months into the war, I think we'd have had a very different outcome now. Whereas now, I think we're seeing a very different axis of nations that have common interest. I'd be very careful before we leap to the fact that they're going to be military bedfellows. I'm not sure that's the case. I'm not sure China quite aligns itself with Russia militarily. But for the time being, it suits China's agenda to get loads of cheap oil from Russia. And that's also true for India.
And how does that compare, at least in the visuals we're seeing today? Putin and Modi walking hand in hand, all of these men closely conversing on camera. How does that compare to the imagery we've seen out of the way Trump has treated his allies here in Europe and NATO?
Yeah, it is. I always try to be a bit careful about politics because, as a military guy, I have to say over the years I became to despise more and more of our politicians because, yes, you can write stiff letters. Yes, we summoned the Russian ambassador because of what's been happening in Kyiv. And but as a military guy, I look and go, does that really do anything? Did the ambassador actually even go back and call President Putin to give him some feedback? Or did President Putin just go, I don't want to take your call. I know what you went through. Tough. It isn't going to change a goddamn thing. And I think, therefore, for me, the shift slightly is that we, at the end of the Second World War, in an effort to stop wars happening again, institutions like the United Nations, institutions like NATO were formed, not because they were going to keep the peace, but they generated conversations. They stopped nations hiding behind their own walls, becoming isolated, insular, and self-serving. Because, as I said, every country's got to look after its own national interests, but you've got to make sure that doesn't bubble up into unnecessary friction. And I think what we're seeing with the behavior of America at the moment, very, very firmly America first, very, very firmly we don't care about the rest of the world. I think that is disturbing because it's undermining the whole institutions that were there to make sure that peace was preserved. And there's also a view, through great power comes great responsibility. And traditionally, that has been one of the key roles of America. We're seeing them edge back from that at the moment. And I don't think it's a surprise that we're starting to see a more global, a disruptive global situation. If you were an American, you'd say, it's thousands of miles away from me. Why do I care? There are a couple of examples in history where it can come back to bite you.
And so where does all of this leave Europe and Ukraine's European allies if they aren't going to get as strong of a backing from the US anymore and they are seeing perhaps a more unified opposition from Russia and its alliances or friendly relations with other nations?
Well, Louis, I think what you're touching on there is one of the most profound moments of the war so far. And I'm not trying to be melodramatic here at all. You and I, for 3.5 years, on and off, we've had conversations about the war. We've talked about the advent of tanks going in, or long-range missiles, or tactical things. But largely, we have been watching this war from a distance. Ukraine isn't a member of NATO, so we have no legal obligation to help. But we sort of recognise that if Ukraine was to fall, that European security would be compromised. And also, if we start allowing bullies to prevail, where does that leave us? But we've done it in a sort of hypothetical way. We've not wanted to get our skin in the game, and I understand that. I think we've now seen the very limits of what diplomacy can do, limits of what sanctions can do. We've just been through that. I think Russia is hurting. There's no doubt that its economy. So we could go through details of how it is, but I think the profound moment is: does the West want to stop Putin? Not necessarily go to war with Putin, but flirt with going to war with him to demonstrate, because neither side wants a nuclear exchange, and that doesn't serve anybody's purpose. But standing toe to toe with Putin and go, that's enough. That is far enough. We cannot tolerate this. If you're genuinely keen on talking, we'll talk, but this has to stop. And being prepared to put some muscle behind that. And if the West isn't prepared to do that, then I think we're going to have to live with the consequences and know that no decision is actually a decision. And as a scholar of a little bit of military history, the worry is nobody wants to go to war. No, people say, oh, you're a warfighter, you want to go to war. Nobody serving in the military wants to go to war. Nobody. They've seen firsthand the impact of it. What they do recognise is the more the robust you can be in deterrence, the more your nation's enemies decide, the risks are far outweighed by the benefits of taking you on. And that's the bit we seem to have lost. We used to stand on the war in the Cold War, scared stiff that we'd have to go to war, but putting on a very brave, strong face to make sure that nobody would want to find out. We seem to have lost that essential element of military capability. And the danger is if we just keep walking away from this, it will come towards us. And I do worry. And that's why I think we've got a really profound moment approaching us about where do we as a nation sit on this? Are we just going to sit and let Putin do whatever he wants to do and leave it up to Poland next to stand the line and other nations? Or are we going to make a far more robust stand? And I think that's the difficult choices facing some of our European leaders.
Yes, and meanwhile, the war in Ukraine carries on the ground. The Institute for the Study of War is reporting, in fact, that a lot of Russian military bloggers are growing increasingly frustrated with the slow progress Russia is making in the Donbass when compared to the cost in terms of troops and casualties. With most estimates putting the capture of the Donbass taking as long as years or maybe 4 years. Is there any major strategic objective Putin can hope to gain in 2025?
I think this is a fascinating question, Luke, because bluntly, if you'd asked me that in sort of February, March of this year, I think most military analysts would have said that Putin was focused. It's hurting the economy. It's hurting him militarily. It's running out. He's got an issue of generating troops. But if he can take those 4 air regions, Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, the land bridge down to Crimea, then that would be an understandable military objective. Whether he would pause for 5 years and then come again, that's a different story. And at the time, you went, Ukraine is getting a fair bit of support from the West, but manpower, it's struggling to generate the forces, the troops involved. And actually, Putin's forces, they started this war fairly incompetent, but inevitably, 3.5 years of war, they now understand. They've changed their tactics. They are much more careful. They're much less vulnerable to being targeted. And of course, as the West's smart weapons dried up, Ukraine got dragged into this war of attrition, which is something that Putin would know he can win. So therefore, the expectation in springtime was that this would be an incredibly difficult summer for Ukraine. Now, it has been incredibly difficult. But have Russia made the advances that they would have expected given the resources they've expended? Absolutely not. And I think part of that is Russia is not the only country that's learnt. And if I was to be really simplistic, if you are on the offense, you generally lose 4 or 5 times more soldiers than you do on the defense, because you have to leave your foxholes and charge at the enemy, metaphorically speaking. And of course, Ukraine has become very smart, particularly with the use of drones, and making it very difficult for Russia to make any tangible progress. Now, but let's not kid ourselves. They are on the front foot. Russia is taking ground and settlements, but the Donbass, without getting too much in the detail, there's a line of towns in the Donbass, and those towns are really difficult to take. You'll remember the battle for Bakhmut took a year, 60,000 casualties, and the place was leveled. There are three of those Bakhmuts in a line, and the chances of Russia taking those anytime soon is very slim. Why does Russia want them? Because then it's got a toehold, a springboard to go much deeper into Ukraine if it wants to. Why does it not want Ukraine to have them? Because Ukraine could use them as springboard to sever the land bridge, and therefore that's why those are sort of non-negotiable for Russia. But I think that's one of the reasons why I think we heard some of our European leaders talking this week about preparing for the long war, because it doesn't feel like we're going to get a solution anytime soon to the current conflict.
And last week was another week of intense Russian strikes on Kyiv. What's the objective that the Russians are trying to achieve with that bombardment of largely civilian areas? And is it having any tangible strategic effect?
Yeah, I ended up doing quite a few chats over after that strikes, because uh, in the same sort of words, basically, I think there were nearly one particular night last week, there were over 600 drone strikes, 31 missile strikes, a lot of civilians killed, and a lot of civilian damage being done. And there were lots of questions about, so why is Russia targeting civilians? Is this just, and it's easier to paint Putin as the bad guy. Why are you doing that? Now, regardless of whether he's a bad guy or not, it's not my. The point is, you don't generally have excessive amounts of drones and missiles, so you don't want to waste them. And I don't. Any loss of life is tragic, but if you're going to win a war, you're not going to win the war by killing a few civilians. You kill. You're going to focus on your military targets. So I have no doubt at all that. So the question is, what is Russia actually targeting? In the war up till now, in the winter, Russia's targeted energy infrastructure to make life as miserable as possible for people in Kyiv. And in the summer, it's tended to focus on transport and logistics hubs, stuff like that. The big thing that's changed this year is that President Zelensky is very, very determined to get the defense industrial base of Ukraine up and firing. He talked famously about wanting to generate 1 million drones from their own industry, and also there's some other weapons which you might get onto that they've developed as well. Now, if you can take out the energy infrastructure, if you can target those factories, now all of a sudden you start to make a difference to the front line, and that is where I think, plus the F-16s, don't forget those. They are making a difference. Russia is undoubtedly trying to target those, and there's another story about how they're being survivable. So then the question becomes, if they try to target those, why are they hitting so many civilian buildings? Well, you only have to look at the stats. 600 drones. Ukraine claims that 90% of them they shoot down or jam or whatever. Where do they come down? You shoot them down, you jam them. It doesn't mean they suddenly disappear. You don't vaporize them. They still come down with a fair chunk of explosive in them, and they hit and explode where they land. I was last time I was in Ukraine, I was in Kyiv looking around at some of the damage, and you could see how some of this stuff wasn't targeted. It was just stuff had fallen out of the sky and caused damage. Now, that's not blaming the Ukrainians for shooting it down. It's just saying that the very success Ukraine is having at protecting its core infrastructure, stopping these drones hitting their intended target, doesn't mean they don't hit something. And tragically, there are a lot of people getting killed when they're there. And I think you're off to Ukraine shortly as well. And I'd be surprised if, first of all, you'd imagine that Kyiv is like the London in the Blitz, and it's not. It's huge. It's a beautiful city. But of course, when things do come down, it's a densely populated area. Tragically, civilians die. So I think this is it's not about, in my humble opinion, it's not about Russia deliberately throwing valuable missiles into the middle of a city to try and take out a few buildings. I think it's Russia's incompetence at trying to target energy and industrial capability in Ukraine. And tragically, A lot of people are dying as a result of that.
And Ukraine is also carrying out its own air campaign on Russian energy and logistics. A power transformer went up in flames in the Krasnodar region just yesterday. That's also starting to have an impact on domestic fuel prices, we're hearing. If the Russians can't put a lid on Ukraine's own air offensive, what happens next?
Yeah, it's been fascinating, hasn't it? So Ukraine has been trying to take the fight to Russia, and if you look at this ground strategically, the West for a long time wouldn't give Ukraine the weapons that it needed to strike inside Russia. There was we'll give you weapons, but you can't fight back. You can strike Russian forces within Ukraine, but you can't strike them within Russia. So Ukraine has been very canny at going, okay, we need to develop our own weapons that can do that. And rather than just spray weapons around, they have specifically targeted energy infrastructure. Russia exports a lot of oil. It does a lot of refining of oil. And therefore, if you can take out some of these targets, they generally are quite flammable. You generally don't need a big explosive to set off a pretty huge explosion. And therefore, if you send a drone, which is very easy to shoot down, okay, I'll send 100 drones and one of them will get through. And Ukraine has been very effective at doing that. Part of the challenge is the long range stuff. Well, they may not be able to buy those off the shelf from the West, but my goodness, have they managed to get all the bits required, throw them together and trial them. If that was in the West, we'd have to do lots of safety cases and we'd have to do trials, all of which would take months or years. Ukraine just bolts them together, fires them off and sees what happens. And if they get to the target, woo! And if they don't, okay, let's try doing it slightly differently. And it's much quicker, much more agile. And I think that's proven to be very effective for Ukraine. I think we've got to be quite careful, though, to overthink that. Some of our long-range missiles, drone technology, isn't just about a rocket, an explosive pack, and some sort of sensor, because you also want to make sure if it's worth attacking, it's probably worth defending. If it's worth defending, somebody's going to try and shoot your missile down. So how do you protect the missile to make sure it gets through? Now, if you do any of that, it becomes quite expensive, but it becomes more survivable. If you don't do that, you have to focus on quantity and just deluge the defenses to go in there. To date, what Ukraine is doing is just trying to deluge the defenses, and that's proving quite effective. And although, as you say, it is gradually making it more difficult in Russia. So oil prices, domestic fuel prices are going up. But it is worth setting into context. I had a quick look after you and I had a quick banter online. The average price of fuel now for Russians is, I think, 79 cents a litre. The average for us is about 110, 115 a litre. So it's still a fraction of the price that we pay in the West. So I wouldn't suddenly think that, Putin's under massive trouble, because it's still a lot cheaper than it is to fill up your gas tank in Russia than it is in this country. But it is just making it incrementally slightly worse every day.
And we talk about some of those weapons that Ukraine is using in the air. They've unveiled, as it were, last week, this new FP5 Flamingo missile. What sort of difference can an air weapon like that make?
Well, yeah, there's a couple of things that intrigue me about this. So let's look at, it's a flamingo. Why is it a flamingo? Because the early missiles came out as pink. And somebody bantering sort of went, oh, it's a bloody flamingo. And that sort of stuck, which is one of the ironies of war, isn't it? But it's a ground launch missile. It's got just over 1,000 kilogram warhead. That's pretty substantial. But in context, most of the bombs dropped in the Second World War were 1,000-pound bombs. This is over twice the size of warhead for that. Range about 3,000 kilometers, so it goes a long old way. And apparently Ukraine is trying to build about 200, 210 of these a month. So they've clearly got some ambitious challenges for it. If you saw pictures of it, it looks pretty substantial. And we're back into okay, how easy are these to get shot down? It's not clear how fast the thing is. Why does that matter? Well, the slower, the easier these things are to shoot down. The faster, the better. And first of all, I admire the fact that Ukraine's now developed its own capability to use long-range weapons, therefore less reliance on the West. But I go back to the point that when you see these weapons, they do look a little bit like Second World War weapons. They've got a slightly oldie, worldy look about them. Are they stealthy? Almost certainly not. Do they have any sort of sophisticated anti-jam capability? Almost certainly not. Can they do terrain following? Can they hide themselves at the bottom of valleys? It doesn't look like it. They may be able to, and therefore, now I don't want to be critical, but it's just a sense of, just because they can now do long range weapons doesn't mean that the weapons that were being provided by the West don't have a place. They absolutely do. And I have no doubt at all that Russia will be looking to target some of the facilities that are making these missiles, because it's just another step to generate some military capability that is indigenous to Ukraine rather than relying on Western aid.
Yeah, and I want to come on to the aid that Europe can provide, but just before I do, there's also been some quite interesting footage out of Ukraine showing a Ukrainian drone discovering a large stash of mines hidden under a Russian bridge and naturally blowing it up. Ukraine has said that these mines were likely left there by the Russians, possibly to blow up the bridge themselves if they needed to retreat behind it. I mean, is this just Ukraine getting lucky and it's the nature of warfare, or is there something to be said here about Russian operational security?
Yeah, I saw this bit of news, and I think what's interesting is that there is a danger of us overthinking this. Let me put it just bluntly. If you are in a military campaign, one of the things that if you're moving forward, you're always worried that your enemy will suddenly cut off your escape, isolate your forces, and wipe them all out. So you're always trying to look at, how do I get out of here in a hurry? And also, how do I, if my enemy decides to flank me, how do I cut him off? And therefore, things like bridges, why are they there? Because generally they are an easy way of getting across an obstruction. Therefore, they are quite an interesting way for you to isolate enemy forces or protect friendly forces in retreat. And therefore, they have a great deal of significance, not just tactical, but strategic significance. And therefore, key bridges you will probably want to mine. I mean, let's face it, that is what they did in the Second World War. They would set up mines around bridges, and it was purely that if your plans didn't go well, your enemy suddenly overran you, you could blow the bridge. Now you could slow them down while you collected. So this is nothing new, I don't think. I think this is simply standard tactics. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if Ukraine is doing exactly the same as Russia is doing, mining various things. And the beauty about drones is you can go and send one off to the bridge, fly it under the bridge, have a good look around, which you would otherwise never be able to do because satellite imagery won't allow you to see below the bridge. So it's a really useful way of making that work. So, yeah.
Well, and just to finish, Sean, Friedrich Merz, Germany's chancellor, has said that we are preparing for a long war in Ukraine. We've talked a bit there about where Europe goes from here, but what is Europe's next step really after this? If the US isn't putting as much in, there's been talks about security guarantees, what they could look like. There's clearly still weapons like the Taurus missile that Ukraine want to be provided by the Europeans. What's Europe's next move, do you think, and what could its impact be on the war?
Yeah, I think Mertz's comment were really interesting, but I return really to the sort of profound nature of what next. If you have got America largely losing interest, and it doesn't mean they're not going to provide weapons, but largely losing interest, the West has for the last 3.5 years provided anti-tank weapons, then tanks, then long-range missiles, then F-16 fighter jets. They've gradually ramped up the support provided. Has any of that stopped Russia's advances? No. Has it slowed it down? Yes. But if you are looking at how are you going to bring the war to an end, the war will only end when President Putin has achieved his objectives or President Putin is forced to stop. It looks very likely, if I was a military advisor to Putin, I'd be telling him to keep pushing because everything is going his way at the moment and the West seems to be fragmenting and he's getting more and more pals in China and as India as we talk. So you shift towards either we wait until Putin's achieves his objectives, and that has profound implications for global security because once he's achieved those objectives, why wouldn't he come and do it again? And what lesson does that send to China, to North Korea, to Iran? Or somebody steps up and stops Putin. And I don't mean World War III, but I mean suddenly turned around and said, like, enough is enough. We are going to match what you're doing, and we are going to make life difficult. And I think simply doing what we've always done in the West of providing support and weapons to Ukraine hasn't achieved the objective. And arguably, it's actually making Ukraine even more badly off, because the longer the war goes on, the more people they lose, the more a generation is lost. And when the war stops, how on earth they dig themselves out of trouble when they haven't got any of the sort of fighting age, working age men to bolster that? Not only to work, because obviously everybody can work, but to start families, to generate the next generation of people out there. So I do think that the West has got to firstly ramp up its weapon production, B, present a much more coherent front, and C, whilst I'm not a fan personally of boots on the ground, I think that's a big escalation. I think starting to step up through a no-fly zone of some form. The West's air power is significantly better than Russia's. It would cause Russia a major headache if that was to happen. It would provide a degree of security for Ukrainians, and would actually be a very robust message that enough is enough, Putin. So I think, and now let's be, I can imagine several listeners, in fact, a number of listeners would go, you're advocating we go to war with Russia. And I'm saying, no, I'm not. But I think that the bit of appeasement never works. Chamberlain in 1938, peace in our time, within a year we were at war. You know, war is horrible, war is dreadful, but Putin has started this. But if we leave it to Putin to stop, where will it stop? We have a military. I think there are ways in which the military can be used to bring this to a halt, which, because Putin doesn't want a world war, he may threaten it, but he doesn't want it. And actually, finally, make a credible, robust gesture. However unpalatable, what we're doing so far hasn't worked. So if we don't do something different, we have to reap the consequences. And I think they could be quite profound.
Well, Sean Bell, retired Air Vice-Marshal and host of the Red Matrix podcast, thank you very much for speaking with me today on Frontline.
You're welcome, Dave.
You've been watching or listening to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for a membership, or you can hear all the latest news and analysis on Times Radio, or read it at thetimes.com. And remember, we are in both podcast and video form. You can find us on your favourite podcast platform. It's Times Radio's Frontline, or you can watch us on Times Radio's YouTube channel. Thanks very much. Goodbye.